The kitchen was silent, save for the gentle tick of the wall clock and the faint rustling of leaves outside, caught in the autumn breeze. Janet stood at the counter, hands frozen on the cutting board, a knife gripped tight in her trembling fingers. Her eyes were glassy, distant. The weight of the day had settled deep into her bones. Too much stress, too much loss. Her thoughts circled back to the unbearable feeling of being trapped, overwhelmed by everything she couldn't escape. Then, out of the corner of her eye, a soft sound broke through her fog. Buster, her little French Bulldog, was at her feet, his tiny body pressed against her leg, his dark eyes staring up at her with quiet understanding. It was as if he could sense her pain, feel the loneliness that had burrowed deep in her heart. She leaned down, stroked his soft, warm head, and smiled a hollow smile. "You're my best friend, aren't you?" she whispered, but something in her chest tightened. The truth was, she didn't know if she could keep going. In the midst of her despair, a sharp, sudden sound broke through. The door to the balcony creaked open, and the wind howled louder. Janet turned around, and in that instant, her heart stopped. The pain in her chest returned, fiercer now. The knife in her hand felt heavier. Everything inside her screamed to just let go. But Buster, still at her side, gave one firm bark. His little feet tapped on the floor, as if urging her to move, to see the life outside, to breathe once more. A wave of desperation crashed through her, but in that moment, with Buster's eyes locked on hers, she knew that her fate was not just hers to decide. And as if on cue, the phone rang. It was a call she never thought she would take, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. Janet sat in the kitchen, staring at the unwashed dishes, the remnants of her last meal long forgotten. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting thin, horizontal lines across the room. It was too quiet, too still. Her heart ached with a quiet sadness that had become a permanent fixture in her life. There was no one left to share her days with. No calls from friends, no visits from family. The silence echoed off the walls, a reminder of everything she had lost. The weight of loneliness pressed heavily on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to even exist. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the rim of her coffee cup, the warmth offering no comfort. Buster, her little French Bulldog, lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. His dark eyes watched her with a knowing gaze. The silent companionship the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. She leaned down, her hands brushing against his soft fur. "You're my best friend, aren't you?" she whispered to him, though she didn't know if she was asking him or reminding herself. There was no response, just the soft weight of his head against her leg, his warm body a small comfort in the sea of cold emptiness. Her thoughts began to wander, taking darker turns. What was the point anymore? The endless cycle of work, isolation, and exhaustion. It all felt so meaningless. A familiar ache gnawed at her insides, the kind that seemed to spread with every passing day. She could hear her breath growing shallow, her thoughts swirling in a dizzying spiral. The knife in her hand felt heavier with every passing second, and her heart seemed to echo with the beat of her growing despair. She was stuck, trapped, alone. But Buster, as if sensing her inner turmoil, gave a low bark. It was soft, hesitant, but there was something in it that made her pause. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and unwavering. He was here with her, always. Janet shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. The moment passed, but his gaze remained, steadfast, comforting. She picked up the knife once again, trying to shake off the weight in her chest, trying to ignore the growing sense of emptiness. But deep down, she knew something had to change. Something had to give. But what? The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm glow across the room, yet Janet felt colder than ever. Her thoughts remained heavy, tangled in webs of uncertainty. Buster sat by the window, his ears perked, his eyes scanning the outside world. It was the first time in hours that he had moved from his usual spot at her feet. Janet was caught in the quiet rhythm of her thoughts when a sharp bark broke the stillness of the air. Buster's small frame was suddenly in motion, his little feet tapping frantically on the floor as he darted toward the door. His bark grew louder, more urgent. It was a warning. Something was wrong. Janet hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she was hearing. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window panes. But there was something else in the air, a shift in the atmosphere, a pressure she couldn't quite explain. She slowly stood, her legs stiff, her body aching as she moved toward the door. Buster continued to bark, his little body trembling with urgency. His warning was clear. Something was about to happen. The tension in the air grew thick. The wind howled outside, its force nearly ripping the trees from their roots. Janet opened the door slightly, just enough to peer outside, and her breath caught in her throat. A flash of light, too bright and unnatural, flickered in the distance. The sound of something crashing, too loud, too sudden, followed immediately. Her pulse quickened as the familiar sense of dread settled deep in her chest. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. And Buster, her little dog, was trying to warn her. Janet's heart raced as she closed the door behind her, still standing frozen at the threshold. The storm outside had intensified, the winds howling like a warning from the universe. Her body trembled as the distant sound of sirens filled the air, but it was more than just the weather that unsettled her. The fear was different this time. Something primal, raw, something that urged her to act. Buster's barks grew louder, but she could hardly hear them over the rising din. The phone rang. It was the last thing she expected. A familiar number flashed on the screen, an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in months. Without thinking, she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Janet, are you all right?" The voice on the other end asked, concerned but steady. For a moment, Janet couldn't respond. She hadn't realized how desperate she had become until the words came rushing out in a choked sob. She had no idea what was happening outside, but inside, everything was falling apart. The phone call was a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. But Buster was still at her feet, his eyes wide with fear, his barking intensifying. She quickly ended the call, a new determination filling her. The storm was no longer just outside. It was inside her too. The time for running was over. It was time to face what had been lurking in the dark corners of her mind. And then, with a single firm bark, Buster turned toward her and ran out the door. The outside world was nothing like she had imagined. The streets were flooded, debris scattered everywhere, and the air smelled like burned ozone. Buster, in his usual fearless fashion, dashed forward through the chaos, leading her to safety. But it wasn't just a storm. Something had gone wrong. An accident had happened right in front of her apartment. A car had crashed, and the driver was unconscious. Janet froze. She knew what she had to do, but she was scared, terrified. Buster, however, was already moving. With a final bark, he darted toward the injured man, his tiny body navigating the debris like a seasoned rescue dog. Janet followed, her heart pounding, breath shallow. As Buster nudged the man's side, Janet quickly checked for a pulse. She felt the faint beat. Then, she saw the blood. It was more than she had anticipated. Her body acted on its own. She ripped open her jacket, using it to slow the bleeding. Buster stayed by her side, calm and alert, guiding her through the chaos. She could feel his eyes on her, steady and unwavering, like he knew she needed him just as much as he needed her. The storm had passed, but the weight of the day had not. The air was clearer now, but it held a quiet tension, a reminder of the storm that had raged both outside and inside Janet. She sat on her couch, her body sore but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. Buster lay at her feet, his little body curled into a ball. The house, once silent and empty, now felt full of warmth, full of life. The healing process would take time, but it had already begun. Janet leaned down, running her fingers through Buster's fur, the warmth of his body grounding her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked up at her, his eyes as steady as ever. He had saved her, in more ways than one. And as the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow across the room, Janet felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed were slow, measured steps toward healing. The chaos of the storm had settled into the quiet, the calm after the storm that felt more like a beginning than an end. Janet woke up early every morning now, a change she hadn't expected. The soft rustling of the leaves outside, the scent of fresh rain still lingering in the air, became a comfort instead of a reminder of the darkness that had once clouded her thoughts. Buster, now more than ever, was her constant companion. She no longer felt the crushing isolation that once defined her existence. His presence, always close, was a soft but constant reminder that she had someone, something, to fight for. He would follow her everywhere, whether it was the kitchen, the bathroom, or the porch. His little body always close, his eyes filled with a quiet, steadfast loyalty that seemed to say, "I'm here." Always. And every time she felt herself beginning to retreat back into the shadows of her mind, Buster's warm body next to hers brought her back to the light. One morning, after a particularly long night of restlessness, Janet found herself standing in front of the window, staring at the sunrise. The sky, still painted with the last remnants of the night's dark blues, was beginning to lighten into pale oranges and soft pinks. It was peaceful, almost serene, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Janet felt a sense of hope. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding on to until now. A part of her that had been closed off, the part that had given up, was beginning to open again. Buster's soft breathing next to her was a constant reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always light, always a way forward. Slowly, her mind shifted. No longer consumed by fear or the weight of loneliness, she started to see possibilities where there once had been only despair. It was as though Buster had guided her out of the shadows, gently but steadily leading her towards something better. She turned to him, her eyes soft with gratitude. He was awake now, his small eyes locked on hers, as if waiting for her to say something. Janet bent down and scratched behind his ears, a soft smile on her lips. "We've got this, huh?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. But Buster's tail gave a small, hopeful wag, and it was all the confirmation she needed. As time passed, Janet found herself thinking more and more about her past. The mistakes, the regrets, the memories that had once felt too heavy to carry. Slowly, she began to examine them. There was a time when the weight of it all would have crushed her, when she would have buried her emotions deeper, letting them fester in the silence. But now, with Buster by her side, it felt different. It felt like it was time to face everything she had been running from. One afternoon, as the light streamed through the window in warm, golden beams, Janet sat at her desk, a journal in front of her. The pen in her hand hovered for a moment, unsure of where to start. But then she began. It wasn't easy, writing down everything that had caused her so much pain. But it felt necessary. The ink flowed slowly at first, hesitant, but as her words filled the page, she felt lighter. It was as if, by giving her pain a voice, she was finally releasing it. The tension in her shoulders, the knot in her stomach, loosened just a little with every word. Buster, as always, sat at her feet, watching her carefully. His presence was grounding, steady. She didn't have to explain herself to him, he simply understood. When the tears came, he didn't shy away. Instead, he nudged her gently with his nose, offering his silent, unconditional support. Janet couldn't help but smile through her tears, running her hand over his head. "I'm going to be okay, aren't I?" she asked softly, knowing he couldn't answer, but also knowing that his quiet, constant companionship said everything she needed to hear. As the weeks went by, Janet found herself letting go of the things that had once bound her in a cage of regret. She stopped letting her past define her, and instead, she focused on the present. On the small victories, like waking up with a sense of purpose, or stepping outside and feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, or simply enjoying the sound of Buster's happy bark. Each moment was a small step toward reclaiming her life, and every step was made easier with him by her side. Janet had spent years living in isolation, a self-imposed exile from the world. The thought of socializing, of reconnecting with the people she had pushed away, had always felt overwhelming. But with Buster's constant companionship, she began to see that there was more to life than the walls she had built around herself. Slowly, she began to reach out. A text to an old friend, a call to family. At first, it felt awkward, strange even, but with each conversation, she felt a little less alone. Buster was always there, by her side, offering silent support as if to say, "You're not alone in this." One afternoon, Janet walked through the park with Buster, her heart a little lighter than it had been in years. She passed by families, children laughing, couples holding hands, and it struck her that life was still beautiful, still full of moments worth experiencing. As she sat on a park bench, watching the world go by, she realized that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of living anymore. Buster, his little tail wagging, lay beside her, content in the quiet simplicity of the moment. Janet's eyes softened as she looked down at him. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying a weight of gratitude she could never fully express. The world was still as chaotic as it had ever been, but now, with Buster by her side, Janet felt ready to face it all. No longer weighed down by the isolation that had once defined her, she was learning to embrace the beauty of the world around her. With Buster's love as her anchor, she was rediscovering a world full of possibilities, one step at a time. Months passed, and though the journey hadn't always been easy, Janet found herself standing taller, breathing deeper. She had come a long way from that dark day when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear. Now, every day felt like a new beginning, a chance to grow, to heal, to embrace the life she had once thought was beyond her reach. Buster, ever loyal, remained by her side. His small body, so full of energy and love, had become a symbol of the strength she had found within herself. Together they had weathered the storm, both the one outside and the one within. And as Janet watched the sun set one evening, casting its soft glow across the horizon, she realized that no matter what came next, she would face it with Buster by her side. The world was still full of uncertainty, but in this moment, with the sound of Buster's contented breathing beside her, Janet knew one thing for sure. She was not alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Janet's life, in many ways, had been rebuilt from the ground up. What had once been a fractured existence now felt like a delicate masterpiece, each day slowly adding another layer of color, another piece of the puzzle fitting together. And Buster, her little French bulldog, was the cornerstone of it all. His loyalty, his quiet presence, had become the steady thread that wove her back into the fabric of life. But despite all the strides she had made, there were still moments when the shadows of her past crept in. Still moments where her heart trembled at the thought of slipping back into the darkness. It was in those moments that Buster would be there, as if he had known all along that this was the true purpose of their bond, not just for the good times, but for the darkest, loneliest hours too. He was her light, her reminder that, even in her weakest moments, there was something worth fighting for. One evening, as the soft glow of twilight washed over the living room, Janet found herself sitting quietly on the couch, Buster curled up in her lap. The room was filled with the gentle hum of the world outside, distant traffic, the rustle of the wind through the trees, the faint sounds of neighbors laughing. Janet felt a peace she had not known in years. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was real, and it was hers. Her fingers absently traced the soft fur on Buster's back as he snored lightly. He had always been by her side, but now, more than ever, she understood the depth of their connection. It was unspoken, but it was there, woven into the very fabric of her being. She had given him everything she had, and he had given her more than she could have ever imagined in return. He had saved her not just from a storm, but from herself. As the months turned into a year, Janet's transformation became undeniable. She had rebuilt more than just the pieces of her life. She had rebuilt herself. The woman who once wandered through her days in a fog of despair was now a woman who lived with intention, with purpose. Each day was no longer just about surviving. It was about embracing the beauty in the small moments, like watching the way the morning sunlight danced across the kitchen table or feeling the cool breeze against her skin during her afternoon walks with Buster. Buster had, in his quiet way, taught her to cherish the simplicity of life, no longer consumed by the weight of past mistakes or the shadow of loneliness. Janet found joy in the ordinary. They spent their days together, side by side, whether it was strolling through the park, curled up on the couch with a book, or simply watching the world go by from the safety of her apartment. Every moment was a reminder that she had not only survived but had thrived. One afternoon, as Janet sat by the window, watching a family walk by with their own dog, a small pang of longing pierced her chest. It wasn't for something she had lost. It was for something she had never known. She had never experienced the closeness of a family, the comfort of unconditional support outside of Buster. And yet, in this moment she realized that she didn't need anything more. She had everything she needed. Buster had been the anchor that kept her grounded when the waves of life threatened to pull her under. Together they had forged a life that was rich with meaning, full of love and bathed in quiet strength. She stood up, stretching her back, and turned to Buster, who had been watching her with those knowing, dark eyes. She smiled and knelt down to give him a gentle scratch behind the ears. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she murmured. He wagged his tail. His eyes filled with a quiet understanding that only he could offer. They had both been on a journey of healing, and they had both found their way back to each other. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of Janet's life. She had learned to embrace the unpredictability of each day, understanding that life, much like the weather, would always have its storms. But with Buster at her side, she knew that she could weather anything that came her way. One crisp autumn afternoon, Janet found herself standing at the edge of the park, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and lavender. Buster, his little paws tapping along the pavement beside her, seemed just as content as she was. There was no rush, no pressing need to be anywhere but here, with him. It was a rare moment of stillness, of peace, and she soaked it in like a thirsty flower. In the distance, a family was playing with their dog, the laughter of children echoing in the cool air. Janet smiled softly, watching them for a moment before turning to Buster. "I don't need much, you know," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "As long as I have you, I'm good." Buster's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and his tail wagged in response, though he said nothing. He didn't have to. Their bond, the one they had built together, was stronger than words. It was a bond of loyalty, of trust, and of shared experiences. It was a bond that had saved them both in ways they would never fully understand. As the night began to fall and the world around them softened into shadows, Janet took one last deep breath. The air was cool, the scent of fallen leaves filling her senses. She looked down at Buster, who was now looking up at her with those soulful eyes, and knew without a doubt that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Together, they had already survived the worst. And now together, they would face whatever the future held. A few weeks later, as winter began to settle over the city, Janet stood in her kitchen preparing dinner with Buster curled up at her feet. The soft hum of the oven, the rustling of the cutting board. Everything felt normal. Everything felt right. There was no longer any need for her to run from the past, no need to hide in the shadows of her own mind. She had faced it all, had let herself heal, and in doing so, had found a life that was richer, fuller, and more meaningful than she could have ever imagined. Buster, as always, was there, by her side, a constant, unwavering presence. His small, warm body against her leg was a reminder of the journey they had shared, the bond they had built, and the love that had saved them both. Janet smiled softly, her fingers brushing through Buster's fur. "You're my everything?" she whispered, and for the first time in years, her words felt true. She wasn't just saying it out of habit or obligation. She truly meant it. He had saved her life, not just in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet, everyday acts of love that had come to define their bond. As she finished preparing the meal and placed it on the table, she looked down at him one last time, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Forever," she murmured, "we'll be together." And in that moment, she knew it to be true. There would be no more darkness. No more running. There was only love, the love of a woman and her dog, a bond that nothing could break. And as the world outside began to settle into a peaceful, silent night, Janet closed her eyes, her hand resting gently on Buster's head, and for the first time, she knew that no matter what happened, she would be okay. They would always have each other. Always. Janet sat in her kitchen, the sunlight filtering softly through the half-drawn blinds, casting a delicate pattern of shadows on the floor. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dust, a scent that always lingered after the morning routine. Everything about the moment felt painfully normal, almost too normal for someone whose life had once been a series of quiet struggles, too many unanswered questions, and too many lonely nights. Yet here she was, sipping her coffee, watching the clock tick away the hours of another day that she wasn't sure she wanted to face. But then, as if summoned by the quiet despair that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud, Buster, her French Bulldog, waddled over to her, his little paws tapping softly against the tile floor. He came to a stop at her feet, looking up at her with those soulful, dark eyes that seemed to hold an unspoken understanding of the weight she carried. With a slight nudge of his head, he pressed his small body against her leg, his warm, soft fur a subtle reminder that she wasn't completely alone. Janet ran a hand through his fur, feeling the heat of his body. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the peace his presence brought. "You're my best friend, you know that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. But the truth of it hung heavy in the air, undeniable. For as long as Janet could remember, Buster had been there. He was more than just a pet. He was her companion, her silent anchor in a world that often felt too overwhelming. The first time they met, he was just a tiny ball of fur, his oversized ears and big, round eyes full of unspoken curiosity. She had adopted him on a whim, never fully realizing how much he would come to mean in her life. She had no idea back then that Buster would save her, not just physically, but emotionally, and in ways she couldn't have anticipated. That day, the weight in her chest felt heavier than usual. Life had a way of beating her down, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things were never going to change. There was always something in the background, always a nagging voice telling her she wasn't enough, that she wasn't capable of more. And for a while, she had believed it. But then came Buster, with his constant loyalty, his wagging tail and bright eyes, reminding her of the small joys life had to offer. No matter how lost or tired Janet felt, Buster would always be there, looking up at her like she was the center of his universe. She had never understood that kind of love before. Unquestioning, unwavering. And in some strange, almost mystical way, it was what kept her going. The first sign of trouble came one evening when the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The dark clouds had gathered overhead, and the air was thick with the promise of a storm. Janet stood by the window, watching as the trees swayed violently in the wind. It seemed as if the world outside mirrored the chaos inside her. A deep, gnawing emptiness was settling in her chest, and she felt herself teetering on the edge. She had fought it for so long, the darkness, the doubt, the overwhelming weight of her thoughts. But tonight it felt suffocating. Buster, sensing the change in her, padded over to her feet and looked up at her with an expression that somehow said everything without a single bark. He placed his head on her foot, his small body trembling slightly. It was a moment of quiet understanding, and for the first time in weeks, Janet allowed herself to lean down and rest her forehead against his soft, furry head. She closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him. "Why does it feel so heavy, Buster?" she murmured, as if he could answer. And yet she knew. She knew that he couldn't provide the answers, but his mere presence made the burden of her questions a little easier to bear. In a world that felt like it was crumbling around her, Buster was the one constant she could cling to. But just as she was about to step back, the door to the balcony creaked open on its own, the wind pushing it wide. Janet froze. The storm outside seemed to swell in intensity, and her heart began to race. Something felt wrong, too wrong. She hurried over to the door, pushing it closed. But as she turned around to face the room again, Buster was no longer by her side. Instead, he was at the door, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the balcony. His ears were back, and his small body seemed to vibrate with energy. Janet's pulse quickened. "What is it, Buster?" she asked, her voice trembling. Without warning, Buster gave a sharp bark, the kind he reserved for moments of genuine urgency. The sound seemed to crack through the air like thunder, echoing in her mind. Janet quickly moved toward the door, unsure of what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she wondered if her own mind was playing tricks on her. But as she approached the door, she saw it. The storm outside had shifted, and the winds had picked up to an unnatural level. The trees were nearly bending to the ground, and the sky had darkened to an almost unnatural shade of black. But it wasn't just the weather. There was something more, a sense of impending danger that seemed to hang in the air. Janet's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial for help, a loud crash echoed from outside. A flash of light caught her eye, and she rushed to the window just in time to see a car careening out of control, slamming into a tree just outside her apartment. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was out there. Someone was in danger. And without thinking, Buster ran toward the door, barking furiously. Janet hesitated for a moment, the fear coursing through her veins, but then she realized. This wasn't just any ordinary situation. Buster wasn't just barking for attention. He was warning her, urging her to act. She grabbed her jacket, her heart racing as she followed Buster outside. The storm was relentless, but Buster's small, determined form led the way, his little legs cutting through the wind like a beacon. She could hardly keep up, but she knew, if she didn't act, someone might not make it. When she reached the crash site, the chaos of the storm intensified, but Buster was already at the car, his tiny body darting around it like a seasoned rescue dog. Janet's hands shook as she tried to assess the situation. The driver was unconscious, his head slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down his forehead. Without hesitation, Janet pulled open the door, her mind racing as she tried to stay calm. Buster, never leaving her side, gave a quiet, determined bark, as though telling her to hurry. Janet didn't need another nudge. She was already working, applying pressure to the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. The sound of Buster's bark had given her the strength she needed. Her hands moved swiftly, her heart pounding in her ears. Time seemed to slow as she worked, trying to save the man whose life hung in the balance. And as the storm raged on, Buster stayed by her side, his presence unwavering, his eyes locked on the unconscious man. In that moment, Janet realized that Buster wasn't just her companion. He had saved her. He had pulled her back from the brink time and time again. And now, he was doing it for someone else. Together, they were a team. It was hours before the ambulance arrived, and the man was safely taken to the hospital. Janet stood in the rain. Her clothes soaked, her hands trembling, but there was a sense of quiet peace settling over her. She had saved a life tonight, just as Buster had saved hers. It wasn't just about rescue. It was about hope, about the bond they shared, the silent understanding that they were never truly alone. As the lights of the ambulance disappeared into the night, Janet looked down at Buster, who was now curled up against her leg, his body exhausted but content. She didn't need to say anything. He already knew. They had faced the storm together and they had come out stronger for it. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We're going to be okay, Buster," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. In the days that followed, Janet's world felt different. The storm had passed, but its aftermath had left her with a deep understanding of what really mattered. The people in her life, the moments that had once seemed mundane, they all held a new meaning. And every night, as she closed her eyes, Buster was there by her side. A constant, unshakable presence. Together, they had weathered the storm, together they had saved a life, and together they would face whatever came next. Because in the end, that's what love was, endless, loyal, and unwavering. And with that, Janet knew, no matter what, they would always have each other.